guys. I hope you guys are doing all right at home there. And we're going to be working on finishing out this chapter, and we're making a few changes to the outline. So you're gonna have to forgive me. I made some edits. I took a few things out at the end and added a few things to the next little section. We were talking about how America is changing and how uh, we were in the midst of the eugenics movement and how there's an anti-immigrant sentiment and how essentially we thought we had a good way uh, of creating a way to weed out the bad genes. Okay, and so uh, we denied or stopped immigration because we thought we were going to breed out all the bad genes. We didn't want the immigrants here for a number of reasons. And this is all part of how we're dealing with foreign countries. And so we'd mentioned that we are trying to prevent a large-scale conflict. That explains the Washington Naval Conference and the Dawes Plan. One more thing we want to mention about foreign policy here is something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and this was something that was a really kind of a noble effort, but didn't have a lot of impact in terms of a practical application. The United States and its Secretary of State at the time, a guy by the name of Frank Kellogg, they came up with an agreement with France, and the agreement is called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And the simple idea behind it was both countries would renounce war as a means of getting what you want. That the only acceptable time to ever fight in a conflict is to defend oneself. Okay, and it's basically trying to outlaw war, or to say specifically, we refuse to engage or to be the aggressor. All right, and Briand, the French official who's behind it, and even though it didn't have any practical effect, it's kind of a signal to the rest of the world that we're not interested in fighting. These things that we talked about, like the Washington Naval Conference, the Dawes Plan, even immigration quotas, and now the Kellogg-Briand Pact, signal that we're trying to isolate ourselves. We don't want to get caught up in another European war or another European conflict. Okay? Now, like I said, it sounds like a good idea on paper, but it's just no practical application. And other countries sign on to it as well, and they all say we won't go to war. Only if we're attacked or provoked will we fight. And we know that's simply just not true. That's not the case. Okay. Now, we want to get now where we're changing things up a little bit, and I'm always a fan of the outline, but I wanted to change the outline a little bit. The next section deals with literary movements in the Harlem Renaissance, but this time period, I feel like there's a gap in our knowledge about what's happening in Black America at the time, and so we're adding some things specifically. And you won't understand the literature of the time if you don't understand the history, and of course, you don't understand the history if you don't understand the literature either. So bear with me, and we're subtracting at the end of the outline. We're getting rid of any references to Japan and what's going on in Asia. We're just going to finish out with this and some prohibition stuff and a few other quirky things going on in the United States. Okay, and so we want to look at first what the background is of Black Americans at the time, and we have to talk about the geography of Black America first. You can see, according to this particular map, the population density shows you where Black Americans are in the country. They are largely in the South. Okay, prior to World War One, this is where Black Americans typically lived. Right, and Black America in the South, we know that has not been a very wonderful environment throughout the 18th and early 19th century up to the Civil War. Black Americans were enslaved. They had no rights. They were regarded as property. But even after the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, which outlaw slavery and supposedly give Black Americans voting rights and citizenship, there are problems. Okay? Southerners hated the idea that Black Americans were considered their political equals, and so Southern states started passing what we call Jim Crow laws. Okay? And these were unfair laws aimed at trying to diminish the citizenship and the humanity of Black Americans. Okay, and out of all the Jim Crow laws, one of the biggest problems that Jim Crow laws created was access to voting. Okay, and Southerners, and we'll talk about these in depth later on, but Southerners were very good at creating uh, ways to prevent black people from even registering to vote or voting at all, even if they were registered. For example, using violence or intimidation. They have what were called poll taxes, requiring that you pay a tax before you actually register to vote. Many states would engage what were called literacy tests, which would require you to pass a written exam or to prove or demonstrate you were literate beyond a fifth grade education. And these were ways to prevent black people from voting. And if black people can't vote, they don't get their own representatives in office. And so white governments were able to pass more unfair laws. Okay? And Jim Crow laws were largely designed at segregating society. You had black and white areas. You can see here, this is at a bus station. There's a colored waiting room versus a white waiting room. Every public facility, including schools, public accommodations in general, restaurants, drinking fountains, restrooms, they're segregated by race. And if you violated one of these rules, it was considered not only something punishable by the police, but it was considered punishable by white people. That if you engaged in one of these illegal activities, they felt like they had the right to attack you. And so Jim Crow laws, the denial of voting rights, this really pushes black people to the limit. Okay, so they're frustrated, they're upset, and Jim Crow laws are going to cause people to essentially get the heck out of there because they're tired of it. Right. Also, at the time, a lot of stereotypes and bad literature were trying to reinforce the ideas that white people were superior and black people were inferior. White people had long regarded black people as intellectually incapable of learning or excelling in some type of academic area the same way that white people were. There's a lot of bad scientific literature that goes to the eugenics movement and basically regards black people as an inferior group. Okay, so the same thing that immigrants were experiencing to a degree was happening to black people, but it happens worse because there's a deep-seated hatred of black people in the South. There's a misunderstanding. People think that black people are not only intellectually inferior, but they're lazy. Um, and so bad literature and stereotypes were only reinforcing what the Jim Crow laws were already doing, and that's segregating black people and convincing white people that that's where black people need to be. Okay, as a result of these problems, the Jim Crow laws, the bad stereotypes, etc., black people start leaving town in what's known as the Great Migration. Okay, and the Great Migration, number one, is an escape for black people. They start moving north, right? And one of the reasons they start moving north, obviously, they're tired of what's going on in the South, right? But not only that, there's a distinct need for labor in the North. Factory development, which we've talked about during the Gilded Age and even up through the early part of the century, factories had been upping their production, expanding, and you needed more workers in the North than you did in the South. And so ultimately, black people saw an opportunity. It's not just an escape, but it's an opportunity to have a better job that's not physically as demanding. If you lived in the South, generally, if you were black, you worked in some type of agriculture, and farming can be extremely difficult on, take a physical toll on your body. And so the Great Migration, you're going to see black people moving to the north in large numbers. When you look at this this map right here, you can see, depending on where somebody lived in the South, their ultimate destinations. And to a large degree, the southern states that we think of the deep South, like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, you can see they're going to urban areas that we associate with big urban areas, particularly like the Chicago area, New York City, Boston, Richmond, Washington, D.C. to an extent. But all the cities that you see here are considered destination cities. All right. And so you get these people who are moving up north through what we call the Great Migration. All right. Also, you have to remember too that during World War I, immigration slowed down a little bit, And also, the immigration laws of the 1920s mean that we don't have as much cheap labor through immigrants in the North anymore. So, black people are filling that void in terms of employment. Okay? Now, when black people start moving north, not everybody takes it so well. A lot of black people thought this was an opportunity, that the North was far more tolerant of black Americans than the South, and that's true to an extent. But that doesn't mean that Northerners were welcoming them with open arms. Okay, one of the biggest problems that black people encountered was being unable to find permanent housing. A lot of white neighborhoods didn't want to sell to black people, and they wanted to keep their neighborhoods, quote, racially pure. All right. And so, for a lot of black people, there were only certain parts of cities that were acceptable for someone to sell them a home in. And so, they would often find themselves in rundown apartments, living together in groups, in large families, or just unable to get the bank loans they needed to buy a house because white bankers often wouldn't provide them a loan. So, there's a great deal of difficulty in finding a house or permanent residence. Okay, but one place in particular does turn into kind of the mecca of Black America, and ironically, it was traditionally a white neighborhood. In New York City, you are probably familiar, at least you've heard of Harlem, and Harlem used to be an all-white community within New York City. But Harlem is the one area where a lot of individuals didn't seem to care to sell to black people. And once a few black families start moving in, some of the white racist families in that area decided to leave. And all of a sudden, Harlem becomes a black community, right? And it's going to become the center of kind of the art and music and literary movement in America for black Americans, okay? But because of people in the North not exactly feeling, that it's not that they weren't overtly racist in some situations, but they felt like black people were coming to the North and insisting on being treated as equals. And a lot of people in northern states did not necessarily see black people as equals. And in the 20s, in the teens and 20s, you saw a series of race riots, right? Uprisings where white Americans expressed their anger and their outrage, and often in ways that were uh, hazardous to the health of everyone. Okay, and perhaps no incident is more of an issue than in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921. Right, a race riot erupts that is so raucous that by the end of it, after several days, you had a good portion of Tulsa burned down, including areas of black homes and black businesses. But also, you have over 800 people injured, dozens are dead, and most of them are black. Right? And the whole thing starts over a black man being accused of raping a white woman. And we later on, the evidence suggests now that the rape never happened. That perhaps this black man actually startled a white woman, but there was no actual sexual assault that took place. Okay, but because of that, uh, he's taken into custody at the local courthouse, and at the courthouse, a white mob develops around the courthouse, and the white mob demands that this black man be turned over to them so that they can exact their own justice. They plan to kill him. Right? The police and other officials refuse to turn the suspect over to the white mob, and while they're doing this, black individuals arm themselves and they show up at the courthouse to confront the white mob. The violence that ensues is leaving places like this. You can see the city of Tulsa here smoldering on fire. And you have to realize at this point, too, Tulsa had developed a little bit of a respectable community among African Americans where they were actually seeing progress, right? You also see in the aftermath here, buildings are destroyed, set on fire, and it was so bad in some instances, private residents got in airplanes and dropped homemade bombs over black neighborhoods in the city. Right? You can see here another bombed out part of the neighborhood, burned out, bombed out, people destroying things, and they're taking out all their rage on whoever they encounter that isn't white, or in some instances, they would perpetrate violence against white people who were supportive of black people in the community. Right? If this wasn't enough, you also see a slight uptick in the number of lynchings. Okay, if you're not familiar with lynchings, these are incidents where white people feel that black people have violated some unseen code or unwritten code or one of the Jim Crow laws, and they decide to take matters in their own hands and hang people. Right? At the center of a lot of these lynchings was the white supremacist group that we know as the Ku Klux Klan. And black people are obviously concerned, but lynchings were not uncommon even throughout the 1920s. And I'll show you a graphic on that in a minute. And if you don't think or if you think that these are isolated incidents or that racism wasn't real at the time, let me show you a couple of other things here. These are postcards that were created after the Tulsa, Oklahoma incident, which is nothing short of a massacre, really. And you can see here that on the left, the postcard shows a dead black man, and he's somewhat covered up because it's a corpse, and they're waiting for somebody to move the body away. And then on the right, you see a postcard of the charred remains of a black man who was the victim of one of these attacks in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Right. Take a look at this as well. This you can zoom in on this specifically, this graphic, if you want to stop and zoom in on it. But each of those dots represents a certain number of lynchings that take place in the United States from 1900 to 1931. And you can see that most of those lynchings take place in the South, but it's not uncommon to see them elsewhere. You can also look at the data. They mark them, the number of lynchings uh, from each state, and it's kind of depressing. West Virginia has 12 separate lynching incidents in it, and you can see it goes far to the north where there are lynchings that occur in northern states. And black people feel like there is no out for them. All right. Now, there is, despite the violence here, a great deal of black advancement at the time. One of the groups who helps organize black advancement is that of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Okay? And in this particular group, their job is to promote black rights all over the country. And they're trying to advance the cause of African Americans. All right? Now, the NAACP is still active today, but they keep the name, but nobody refers to black people as colored people anymore. That's an antiquated term. All right? But the NAACP would take up the cause or provide support and safety in numbers. And for black people, oftentimes safety in numbers was the only way they were going to be safe at all. Black people are aware that walking by themselves or walking in the wrong neighborhood could land them in a situation where they were the victim of unjust violence. All right. Now, black advancement is also helped by World War I. Black soldiers served in World War I and did so in an honorable, respectable fashion. All right. And they demonstrated that, oh, wow, we can be trusted to fight for this country. Okay. You also see an advancement in education and work. Like we said, a lot of the people were moving north in the Great Migration so that they could take on jobs and meaningful work in factories, that they could provide a great environment or a better environment for their family. Education, not only were black people starting to become more educated and pursue college degrees, but you had black colleges who were becoming more prominently known, and just for, in many instances, for black colleges to exist at all was something of a major change for America. And so black people had traditionally been denied educational opportunities, and it wasn't because they were intellectually incapable of learning, it's just because they'd never been given the chance. All right? And so black people are starting to make progress in society. Okay? Now, Something else that's going on at the time was what was called the Pan-Africanism movement. There were a number of individuals, black individuals, who thought maybe we shouldn't be working towards equality or trying to prove ourselves. Maybe we should be focusing on a return to Africa and creating a giant African nation that is free from European colonial rule. All right, that there's a worldwide movement that says that, hey, Africans all over the world aren't being treated fairly in whatever country they're living in, and they're being mistreated in their own homeland where they're being robbed of their resources. Okay, now helping the black advancement along, you get three major leaders at the time. Two of them a little more important than the others, but I'll explain why the third one's there too. Right? And you have to realize that these three guys who are involved in black leadership all have different approaches, and the black community is not as united about how to progress. Okay, the first and more well known at the time was a guy named Booker T. Washington. You see Washington here, and believe it or not, his home is right up the road near Charleston, in a little town called Malden. And Booker T. Washington was a largely self-educated black man who believed that the best opportunity for black Americans was what he called at the time, or what others called, accommodation. And Booker T. Washington said what black people need to do is learn job skills, vocational training, and demonstrate to white people that they're capable of being good members of society. And when they become good members of society, they'll slowly earn the respect and equality with white people. All right? That's Washington's approach on things. Okay? And he said, look, you have to do this slowly over time. You can't expect a major change overnight. And Booker T. Washington helped found several schools, vocational schools, and institutes that were designed to give training, job training, to black Americans. Right? Opposite of Booker T. Washington, though, you got this fellow, W.E.B. Du Bois. Right? And yes, you pronounce his last name Du Bois. It's an Americanized version, but let's not get into that. W.B. Du Bois is pretty well the opposite of Booker T. Washington. Du Bois is, he's got formal education. He's the first black man to have been granted a PhD from Harvard University. So he's educated. He's probably what you call the black elite of the time, very intellectual. And he said, look, Booker T. Washington means well with his accommodation approach, but Du Bois wanted equality right then. He said we shouldn't have to wait any longer. These are things, our freedoms, our right to vote, our right to exist, our right to equality are all guaranteed by the Constitution. And we shouldn't have to wait any longer. All right? How long do we have to wait beyond this? What do we have to do to prove ourselves worthy in white people's eyes? And Du Bois was not accepting of Washington's ideas at all. All right? So you've got Washington, who's like, let's prove ourselves through hard work and vocation. And Du Bois is like, no, we should have every educational opportunity that white people have. We should have our rights and our freedoms now. Segregated society was not something that he thought to be a good thing, even though Du Bois also thought that black Americans needed to step up a little bit themselves. He wasn't in the same camp as Washington. And the third guy you've got here is Marcus Garvey. All right, Marcus Garvey's originally born in Jamaica, but moves to the United States, and he is really behind the whole Pan-Africanism movement. The idea that we should be focusing on getting back to Africa. And he thought that, trying to integrate with white people was all wrong. He said, let's get out of here. Let's go back to where we came from, where our people came from, and where we were extracted against our will. And he actually started an idea called the Black Star Line. And his goal was to have this basically passenger ship that would take people back to Africa and help them resettle there. That was his goal. Right? Unfortunately for Marcus Garvey, his idea doesn't get off the ground. There's not, like, he bought a ship, but it was kind of run down, and through mismanagement and bad accounting, his venture never really gets off the ground. And unfortunately for Marcus Garvey, he kind of fades into the sunset there. All right? And so that's where Black America stands when we get into what we call the Harlem Renaissance. But we'll mention that tomorrow along with the Lost Generation.